So during the time period of World War I, you're going to start to see a movement to try to Americanize Mexicans and Mexican Americans. This is known as Americanization. And a part of this is a reaction to something that's called the Red Scare. What is the Red Scare? Basically, there is fear in the United States that there is a rising faction of the Communist Party. Right, Bolshevism, like the Bolsheviks from Russia, right? This movement, this communist movement, and so Americans are afraid that foreigners, maybe Mexicans, might get involved in the communist movement, and there may be a workers' revolution, right? Where workers will overthrow the U.S. government and create this new communist government. So that's the Red Scare, right? And so there was fear that Mexicans and Mexican Americans would get involved in this. And so that's why you see these Americanization programs aimed at Mexicans and Mexican Americans to make them U.S. citizens and to make them assimilate into American culture. Okay, the U.S. government as well as local governments would be involved in offering classes that would help to Americanize Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and employers, right? People who hired Mexicans and Mexican Americans would often require that their employees take citizenship classes, right, to teach them how to be American and teach them American values, as well as language classes is another big thing, right? To try to get Mexicans and Mexican Americans to speak English, right? And so they want to prepare them for citizenship and get them to speak English and to Americanize them culturally. And so part of this movement also was the education system. And so, as we mentioned earlier, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were often segregated, right, in school, in the school system, and they went to what was called Mexican schools, right, that would be separate from the white schools. And often they would receive a poor education there because this education was mainly aimed at training them to take on menial jobs, right? So it's mainly vocational education, like just teaching them a basic trade, not that they would make a lot of money in that trade, but just basic work, and that's the type of education and preparation that they were receiving in these Mexican schools, right? So very poor education, and just basically setting them up to be wage laborers, right? Low-paid, unskilled wage laborers, right? And so the school system, even though they were trying to Americanize Mexican Americans and Mexicans, it was actually setting them up to take a low position in society. Okay. Now, what were some of the weaknesses of the Americanization programs? Why did it not work out? Well, for many reasons. One reason being that Mexico is close, and most Mexicans live in the Southwest, so they can always visit Mexico. They have strong family ties in Mexico still, and many would actually return to Mexico after making a sufficient amount of money. Okay, and so culturally, they remained connected to their home country. Another issue during this time was that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were often isolated from American communities because of their work, right? If they're working out on the railroads, they're out in the middle of nowhere, working on a railroad. They're not in the city. If they're working in the agricultural industry, working on farms, they're away from the community, and so they're not getting assimilated into society. They're still separate, living in their own communities, speaking their own language, keeping their own customs. Okay, and so they don't get assimilated so easily. And finally, Americanization really didn't work out because Mexicans and Mexican Americans received a lot of discrimination and racism. We've been talking about numerous examples of this during this time. So why would you want to become American when you don't feel welcomed, right? You're being attacked because of your race and your culture. So ultimately, the Americanization programs failed, but it was an effort to try to make Mexicans and Mexican Americans become U.S. citizens and get acculturated into American culture. Now, some Mexican Americans wanted to be accepted into the larger American community. And so an example of this would be LULAC, right? The League of United Latin American Citizens. And so LULAC feared that since there were so many Mexican migrants coming into the U.S. during this time, and they were often working for lower wages and being discriminated against, they were worried that Mexican Americans would be lumped in to this group, right, and be discriminated against the same as Mexican migrants were being discriminated against, right? And so they didn't want to be associated with Mexican migrants during this time. And so you see LULAC actually supporting restrictions on immigration from Mexico, right? They wanted stricter immigration laws because they feared that, they would lose some of their rights and some of their privileges if more and more Mexican migrants come into the United States, working for lower wages, being discriminated against, prejudiced, etc. So LULAC would make it to where you could only be a member of their organization if you were actually an American citizen, right? So they wanted restrictions on immigration from Mexico to try to preserve the rights and privileges of Mexican Americans. Another one of their policies was that English would be the official language of LULAC, right, in the organization. So they're trying to be accepted as American citizens during this time. They're trying to fight for Mexican American rights by being accepted into American society, right? And they'll make the argument that Mexican Americans are actually white, right? They want to be accepted as white people. So this is a much more conservative group than the other radical groups that we'll speak about a little bit later in the course, right? And so what were some of the causes that LULAC was fighting for specifically? Well, for one, they wanted the right to vote. LULAC was created in Texas, and remember we were talking about how in Texas there was a movement to try to disenfranchise Mexican Americans, right? So that they would take away the right to vote for them, right? And in some cases they did discourage that right. And so LULAC is going to fight for the right to vote for Mexican Americans in Texas. LULAC also fights for the desegregation of schools in Texas and other public institutions as well. And they'll actually be victorious. So in 1930, the court case Salvatierra versus the Del Rio Independent School District will ultimately end the segregation of schools for Mexican Americans. Now, this is a huge victory, right? So in theory, after this court case, schools will no longer be segregated for Mexican Americans. But in practice, that didn't actually happen because there was a lack of enforcement of the court decision. And so schools were not integrated, and it took a long time until school segregation was actually ended in Texas.